views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening. Good evening. Thanks to everyone for joining us. We're so excited to have you here with us. I just want to start off by saying that this is a very special day. We are celebrating DiVA 2019, but I want you to know that this is a safe space. So if you have questions, if you have concerns, please feel free to voice those concerns. We're here for you, so it's a safe space, okay? My name is Galen Harrison. I'm the Dean of the School of Criminal Justice. And it is so special today that we're here with you in this town hall to discuss domestic violence awareness, resources, and issues. Many of you know that October is a special month, right? We do recognize domestic violence awareness, but domestic violence occurs every month and every day. Domestic violence is insidious, it's pervasive, it cuts across race, gender, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic conditions. Many of us, perhaps you, may know someone who has been or is a victim of domestic violence. I did. Several years ago, I lost a very dear friend to domestic violence. She was an outstanding mother to 3 children, an outstanding wife, an outstanding friend, an outstanding attorney. And she would always greet people with a smile. She always made people feel upbeat. So many of us, even her dear friends, had no idea that she was suffering behind that smile. Psychological and physical abuse. Her life ended, her journey ended in a murder-suicide. On a quiet morning, after she placed her last child on the bus and went to her bedroom, her husband was there waiting for her. He shot and killed her, and then he turned the weapon on himself and he killed himself. So I tell you this because you may have people that you know that smile every day, and that's a good thing, but sometimes behind that smile, there may be something that you don't know. And so if we can get more information to be aware of some of the signs, I think we're doing good work today, okay? I would like to thank several people here for collaborating with us at Monroe College to put together this wonderful event. First, Melissa Saballero, thank you, who many years ago created the DiVA concept, if you will, along with Professor Ann Pauley, and they've worked tirelessly. They've dedicated their careers to bringing awareness to domestic violence. I'd like to thank the Bronx Borough President for joining us today, Ruben Diaz Jr. And guess what? He's wearing purple. He's supporting us today. I'll turn over the mic to him in a few minutes. I'd like to thank representatives from the mayor's office who are here. I'd also like to thank our distinguished panelists, who I will introduce during the panel discussion. I'd like to thank also the criminal justice staff. Where are you? We have Dr. Faison, Program Director for Human Services. We have Paul Litchbrown, Program Director for Criminal Justice. We have, where's Ms. Faye Roberts Paul? She is an extraordinary woman who runs everything. We'd like to thank her. And last but never least, we'd also like to thank Ms. Jackie Ruger from the President's Office, who is there to support us always, so we thank you. So I just want to remind everyone again, this is a safe space, a place where we can discuss and uplift and share information. So with that, I turn it over to Ruben Diaz Jr.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. I just want to thank Dean Harrison. I want to thank Monroe College. Let's give Monroe College, everybody, for this wonderful turnout. Special shout out to Ann as well as Melissa. Before Melissa went to Montefiore, she was the director of health at our office. And for many years, for those of you who don't know, I've been the borough president now 10 years, 10 and a half years. And we've always had a DiVA Talk. We've always observed the month of October when we wear purple, where we discuss this dark secret called DV. Before I get into my comments, I also want to just congratulate and thank all of the panelists and Safe Horizon as well as Montefiore for bringing us all together. I also like the fact that of all of the DiVA Talks that I've been a part of in the last 10 years at least, I see more men in the crowd. Let's give it up for the men here. I haven't seen this many men. I don't want to speak long because I want this to be an exchange and you have wonderful panelists here. I just want to say this. One of the things that we do know about domestic violence is that since 2010 through 2017, if you don't know this, in the city of New York, collectively, we've had over 3,100 homicides in that span. So it's about 8 years span, 8 years recorded. Believe it or not, 548, or I'm sorry, over 500 of those have been domestic violence homicides. So almost a fifth of all of the homicides. Once upon a time, mommy and daddy taught us, and your mom and dad taught you, stay away from strangers. And it seems now like more and more New Yorkers, especially here in the Bronx, where per capita DV homicides are higher than any other borough, it seems like people are being harmed, people are being killed by someone who they thought loved them, someone who lives with them or has lived with them. And what we also know about domestic violence is that more and more of the domestic violence cases in the Bronx and throughout the city of New York have less to do with intimate relationships. And so we're seeing more siblings, and I hope that part of this conversation is about having a broader definition of DV, right? So when I, as the borough president, speak to the chief of police and we talk about murders or incidents in the Bronx, you would be amazed about how many times the cases that we're referring to and speaking about are household cases where people who live with each other, siblings, where domestic violence now is not just about physical or death, but it's about control. It's financial domestic violence. We see a lot of senior citizens being hoodwinked and taken by their children or family members with their finances. We're seeing more and more children in our school system where psychologically this affects them. And so this is the type of conversation that we need to have, because there's still a stigmatization and there's still this fear factor of having this dialogue of people coming out. And hopefully in this conversation here in this room and during this month, we can continue to educate the Bronx, we can continue to educate the rest of the city of New York so that people can seek help. If you are a victim, if you're not even sure, a lot of people aren't sure that they're a victim of domestic violence, please understand that we see you, that we hear you, that we're here to help you, that there are organizations, there is an outlet, for instance, on 161st Street, 198, 161st Street on the second floor, we have the Domestic Violence Justice Center. It is a one-stop shop. And I'm sure that, Ann is going to talk about this. So if you know of anybody, maybe you're here and you're not a victim, but you're here because you know someone, so now you can go back and get them this information. I'm proud of the fact that so many young people are here. I'm proud of the fact that so many men are here. I'm so proud that there's such a diversity in this crowd, because when we speak of domestic violence, this is not about any particular race, any particular gender. any particular economic status. This runs the gamut across the board. And the worst thing that we can do is continue to keep this as a dark, dirty little secret. If we do so, families are being affected, people are dying, and as a society, we'll continue to spiral downward. So just the fact that you're all here and we have this wonderful panel and this conversation and this town hall meeting, I think that it's needed. I just wish that the day will come that we would not have to do this. So congratulations and have a good conversation.
Thank you to our Bronx Borough President for his wonderful remarks. So I'd like to introduce our panelists in no particular order, and then we will move forward with our panel discussion. We have Ms. Melissa Caballero, Senior Director, Office of Government and Community Relations, Montefiore Health System, the University Hospital for Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Ms. Caballero, a former Director of Health and Community Outreach for the Bronx Borough President's Office, has developed health, human services, and civic coordination throughout the Bronx. Ms. Caballero created the DiVA concept. Thank you. We have our very own Professor Ann Pauley. She is a fantastic faculty member in the School of Criminal Justice. She's also a consultant for domestic violence. Ms. Pauley was formerly the director of the New York City program, New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence. She is a court-qualified expert witness on domestic violence. So we thank Professor Pauley. We are proud to also have Dr. Stephen Ippolito, who is a professor in the School of Criminal Justice. At the undergraduate and at the graduate level, he also teaches in the King Graduate School. Dr. Ippolito served with the New York State Division of Parole for nearly 20 years, mostly in Bronx County with the Special Offender Unit, and was assigned to supervise sex offenders, organized criminals, informants for police agencies, and some convicted terrorists. Dr. Ippolito earned over 20 commendations in his career, including the highest New York State award given, the Brian Rooney Award in 1997. Thank you, Dr. Ippolito. We are so proud to have Ms. Maureen Curtis with us again. She has been a very good friend to Monroe College. She is the Vice President for Criminal Justice Programs at Safe Horizon. Ms. Curtis has created liaisons between the NYPD and human services throughout the 5 boroughs of the city. She has provided leadership on liaison between domestic violence, law enforcement, and human services in New York City and in the nation. So we thank Ms. Curtis for joining us. Ms. Liz Ciparel-Huss is a public health social worker, the Office of Community and Population Health, OCPH, at Montefiore Health System in the Bronx. In her current position as Senior Project Manager, Ms. Ciparel-Huss oversees community health initiatives aimed at addressing the social determinants of health. She has previously worked as a clinical social worker for HIV-positive youth and their families at Montefiore, and led Connect to Protect, a Bronx-wide HIV prevention coalition in the Bronx. So we thank her as well for being a panelist. And last but never least, we have Ms. Josefa Romero, who is currently the supervising social worker for the Bronx Supervised Visitation Program. She worked in CVAP as a manager in the Bronx Family Court Program, and I found out recently that she is an alum of Monroe College, so we are proud to have her back. So with that, I'm going to begin the discussion with some questions for our panelists. So my first question is this. Based on your professional experiences, will you please explain to the audience what domestic violence means today and how it has changed in the past? So how has the definition of domestic violence broadened over your years of experience? So anyone would?
Hi. It is certainly much better known than it was in the 1970s when my career started. I remember saying to a group of students at Ohio State University, where I was getting my undergraduate degree, that my topic was going to be about domestic violence. And one of the students said, so that means what, terrorism in the USA? And is that what domestic violence is? It really didn't have an identity. There could be beating your wife jokes. Have you beat your wife lately? Ha ha. Jokes like that. But an enormous amount of ignorance, and yet the police blotter reality of a very controlling partner escalating violence and eventually homicide in people's homes was well known. And in the presidential administration of Ronald Reagan, we started to really see significant health and criminal justice data that women, the Surgeon General announced that women were more likely to be injured in domestic violence than in rape, muggings, and car accidents combined. And from a criminal justice perspective, that the most dangerous location for women is their home. Also at that time, and related, we started to pay attention to the numbers of child sexual abuse. Maybe 1 in 4 girls, maybe 1 in 6 or 7 boys, and almost, maybe 90% of both adult and child victims of sexual assault know their abusers. It is not the creep behind the bushes, little girl, I'll give you candy. It's only a very small part of this vast phenomena that was a secret, is a secret influencer in human behavior, in what we learn about life all over the world.
Thank you.
I mean, I would just add to that, because I think Anne really explained it very well. I would just add to that I think that I've been working in this field for many years now, that one of the things that I think that two things that we're really more aware of is, one, how pervasive it is. It's unbelievable, the numbers, when you think about 1 in 4 women, 1 in 7 men. I mean, think about that. Just in this room, how many potential victims of domestic violence, and for every victim of domestic violence, there's a person who is causing harm to that person. I think the other thing that we've really realized is that we really need to look to the children. There's been a study called the ACEs study that looks at the impact of trauma on children. And one of the traumas that they say is the most impactful, and they have shown, this was a longitudinal study where they looked at the children throughout their life, and they saw the impact that trauma had on these children, whether the trauma was from sexual abuse or domestic violence or divorce in the home. So there was all different types of trauma. And they saw the impact not just on mental health or physical health, but on children growing up and getting involved in the criminal justice system, or substance abusing. And in this study, they said that one of the most impactful traumas was violence in the home. So I think that that's something that we really also have learned, is that we really need to start looking at the impact that this is having, because so many of our programs, including Safe Horizon, are interventions. So we're intervening after the violence has occurred. And we need to start looking at how can we really have an impact in preventing domestic violence from continuing to happen. And we are doing that, but we need to do more of that.
I'll just quickly add that when we started the DiVA campaign well over 15 years ago, we saw mostly women as survivors. I think the population, as the borough president noted, has broadened tremendously. And we understand that not only is the person who the violence is being given is a victim, but their family members, their children. So we understand that there's a much broader impact that happens. But I just like to publicly, before he has to go, thank the borough president for continuing the DiVA initiative, for making it a priority of his administration. And what he didn't tell you is that the Family Justice Center on the 2nd floor of 198 used to be his office space. And he donated and gave it up so that that Family Justice Center could exist. It was the first in the city of New York in the Bronx. So that's major, and we should thank you for that.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. To think about domestic violence, think of it not as one thing, but think of it as many things. It's a system. It's a complex adaptive system, to use the scientific term. It's not simply one spouse assaulting another. It's the spouse who assaults the family pet. It's the spouse who assaults the child. It's a lot of things that hooks into many things. It deals with drug abuse, with alcohol, with post-traumatic stress. So when we think about what domestic violence is, you can also say it's terrorism. The literature now refers to it as a form, the least known globalized form of terrorism. Many of the victims of domestic violence, when I was a PO, we got many complaints. In the 20 years that I was there, I brought, I don't know how many men to, and sometimes women, for adjudication for assault. And I lost every one of those cases because domestic violence is also about relationship. It's a form of addiction when one person becomes addicted to another and dependent upon another and emotionally enthralled to someone else. And it's very difficult to break that system. So when you think about domestic violence, think about also the secondary victimization that goes on with the children. A child doesn't have to be assaulted directly. He can just simply witnessing what goes on between the parents is very destructive. In fact, most domestic violence is learned. Sons learn it from their fathers, they learn it from their mothers perhaps. It's just a learned behavior. So to break that cycle is very difficult. There's another thing that's important. Some of the most infamous people in history were savagely abused in their early years. If you ever get a chance, go online and look for a study that was done by Walter Langer. This was around 1942, 43. The United States Army commissioned him, he was a psychologist from Harvard, commissioned him to do what would now be considered the first psychological profile, probably in American history. And what they did, they gathered all the information on one Adolf Hitler. And turns out that this was one of the most abused people, along with his mother, along with his family. The father was absolutely savage. He used to kick the dog until he urinated. He used to beat the mother until she was unconscious. Nearly killed Adolf Hitler several times. And this man eventually came to lead a country and help get us into probably the most catastrophic war of the 20th century. So the point is that what happens to these victims can sometimes have reverberations in history even. So this is why we need to come to a new, how shall we say, a new milieu where there's a little bit more respect going on in families and even in our schools and neighborhoods, so that this type of behavior will no longer have a place, because it is destructive, and if you study the literature, you'll see just how badly it is. Some quick statistics. The New York City Police Department keeps records on this. We've got some of their numbers here. We don't have the total numbers for 2019, but between 2017 and 2018, we have those numbers. 2017, we had a little more than 7,700 domestic violence complaints that the police responded to. In 2018, it was a little bit higher, about 8,200. The good news is that when we crunch those numbers statistically, we find that there was actually no statistical difference between the two. So things are holding firm. Now, we don't know what's going to happen in 2019, so we'll have those at the end of the year. So thank you all again for being here, and thank you, Professor Pauly, for all the help you gave so many of my students who were caught up in this problem. Thank you.
I just wanted to speak from the healthcare perspective, if I could. I think healthcare is just now really becoming hip to what DV advocates have known for a really long time, which is that where we live, work, and play has a huge impact on health. And actually, a bigger impact on our health and well-being than our ability to get to our medical appointments and take our medication, right? This is something that I think everybody in this room probably knows, but healthcare is now just really, I'd say the last couple of years, I'll give us a little bit of credit, coming around to understanding that we need to ask about these issues. And the other piece of this is, if you ask about these issues, you have to do something about it, right? And just to speak to our work in trying to get providers to screen more for domestic violence issues in general, but also relationship issues like more, domestic violence issues in particular and relationship issues more generally, they're afraid. They're afraid to screen because then they don't totally know what to do, right? And so it's up to us to build these relationships across sectors so that if we have a patient sitting in front of us who discloses this, that we know that we can direct them to someone in what we call a warm handoff, right? We don't just give them a piece of paper to say, here you go figure this out on your own. But we're actually able to make the connection with somebody we have a relationship with so that they can get the support they need when they're ready to get the support. Okay, it sounds simple, it's not that, right? It's pretty complicated. But in addition to working on a patient by patient or family by family basis, like others have said, we need to think about in our communities and in our neighborhoods, what can we do to improve health writ large, and what does preventing violence, how does that relate? So if we talk about the social determinants of health, of course, violence is one of those, but so is adequate housing, enough money for food, being able to access medications, being able to get around, being able to provide child care and elder care for the people we love and care about. All of those things are related, right? And so for us in the healthcare sector, we're just at the beginning of stages of understanding what is our role in addressing these things so that we can improve the health and well-being of people from that preventative standpoint that somebody else talked about earlier. Thank you.
Just to add to what the panel said, also when we think about domestic violence, just think about technology, so how technology has advanced. So a person to abuse another person doesn't have to be in the home. It can be through text messages, talking them through the cyber, internet. Just think about those things as well.
Thank you. And there's great tip cards over there about technology abuse.
Thank you. So I just want to follow up. You did discuss some resources available to assist and support, protect victims of domestic violence. Can you elaborate some more on some of the resources? And also, what are some of the resources to assist abusers? If you could please discuss that as well.
Well, we have now citywide resources. The borough president referred to the Family Justice Center, and Melissa was saying the very first in New York City was here in the borough, the Bronx. We're very proud of it. It is a walk-in service where victims of domestic violence will meet professionals in a whole range of helping roles, and this is a team. The team shares knowledge of domestic violence. They are effective, and they may be psychotherapists, child welfare personnel, police, district attorney, housing specialists, but they are there to really form a support team for victims of domestic violence. And indeed, we do work with perpetrators of domestic violence.
Sure. So I think that, to be totally honest, there's not a lot of services for persons who abuse another person. Most of the programming in New York City and in New York State, and probably across the country, are what are known as batter intervention programs that are court-mandated programs. So it's for people who have been involved in the criminal justice system, and they're usually referred. Here in New York State, the model is an educational model, 26 weeks of 90 minutes a week of education around historical perspective of domestic violence, and with the intent of trying to change the behavior. Sadly, the research across the country has shown that they're not that successful, that they don't really change behavior. Two things that are happening now in New York City. One of them is the mayor's office is looking to pilot a program that will be not connected to the criminal justice system. So it would be involved self-referrals of people who are causing harm that could come into this program, and that should be something that will be starting soon, so that these would be people that are not necessarily involved in the criminal justice system. The other thing that's also been piloted, one in the Bronx and one in Staten Island, and the one in Staten Island is run by Safe Horizon, is really a new model in the field of domestic violence, and that is working with the whole family. So historically, including in Safe Horizon, we're a 40-year-old agency. We work with victims of crime. We used to run the Batterer Intervention Program here in New York City, which was the largest program across the country. But we never worked with the whole family where we worked with them as a unit. So our Batterers Intervention Program was a separate program, and it was court mandated, and it was working with men. It was all men who came into the program through court. And then all of our other services were working with victims, survivors, and their families. In this new model, and I will say that this is in response to what we've been hearing the last several years, survivors tell us what they want. They don't want often to end that relationship. They want to, maintain the relationship. And even if they don't want to maintain the relationship, they want to be able to co-parent with their partner. So this program works with the survivor and the children, and works with the person who's causing harm. In most cases is the a father in the relationship. All the families that are referred to this program are families with children. The great thing about this program is that it's working with the people causing harm through a trauma lens, and which is something that we never did before. I used to be an instructor and a supervisor in the Batterers Intervention Program, and it was purely educational. We never talked about the trauma that the men who came into this program could have experienced prior to them causing harm to their partner. It was all about educating them to change their behavior. Now we're looking at the trauma, and we're saying that, by looking at this trauma, maybe we will be more successful in changing that behavior, so that the mom and dad and the children in that home could heal from that violence. That and there's still accountability. So it's not like the violence that occurred will be excused, but it's looking at it through a different lens. And we believe that this is going to be successful. And I think that most importantly, it's responsive to what our clients have been telling us that they want to see happen differently.
How's everybody doing out there? I know this is a heavy subject. Everybody with us? There's going to be time for Q&A, so if you do have a question, keep it in the back of your mind. I'm really happy to hear that we're working with families now. I've been a little disconnected with direct services for quite some time, but when I was actively engaged, we received a federal grant at the Borough President's Office for some of the work that we were doing, and we could not spend a penny, not one penny of that federal money working with batterers. Not one. And that was a disservice back then, and I think it's still a disservice today. I don't know if the federal government has now eased those restrictions a bit, but I absolutely agree that because something like domestic violence affects an entire family, it is the entire family that should be accessible to the services.
Can any of you discuss or explain the cultural implications that may affect a victim's ability or desire to get assistance if they are a victim of domestic violence? So the cultural implications. Can someone elaborate on that?
That's a tough question. Are you referring to why the factors in our culture that impact
Yes, that
somebody's
would
reluctance to
prevent,
come
exactly.
forward. Yeah. I think it depends on a lot of things, right? I want to say that in our culture writ large, we're still feeling the effects of the legacy of the patriarchy, right? Where in the dominant culture, white men were the folks that had power and were subservient over everybody else, and in particular women, right? And so that's sort of the foundation of this that I think we're coming from. In terms of individual culture, I think when I was a domestic violence advocate many years ago, but in Boston, so not in New York, but I think one of the things that we heard a lot was this kind of, if you will, excuse for certain cultures for domestic violence happening in that culture. Oh, that culture, that's accepted over there, or in this country, domestic violence is okay. And some of you might have heard that before, right? And I think the message that we always said, and I imagine my folks here at the table who are really involved still in DV work would say, is that no culture thinks that violence is okay. Violence against women, any kind of violence is okay. But that when we have stricter gender norms and gender stereotypes, domestic violence is more likely to happen, right? And so that's sort of the frame that at least I'm coming from with this. And so that means that you have folks that, not necessarily because of the culture that they're from, but if they are involved in a situation where there are stricter gender roles, they might feel reluctant to come forward. I think we also see this, and I can speak to my experience working in the HIV clinic where I would see a lot of LGBTQ youth. And so for them, disclosing that they were experiencing domestic violence meant that they had to out themselves with their provider in terms of their sexual orientation or their gender expression. And so that's another level, right? So not only are you telling somebody that you might not know what's going on in your relationship, you also have to tell them who you love and who you have sex with. So it's very complex, I think.
I've sometimes here at Monroe and with classes asked students the following: what do 9 plus 1 and 5 plus 5 and 8 plus 2 and 6 plus 4 all have in common? 10. They equal the same thing. And my point is that there are different cultural orientations and cultural patterns with different gender roles, but domestic violence is widespread in the cultures of the earth. I love Liz's point. All of our cultures have images of peace and beauty and love that can motivate people. But we have this issue of a very hidden nature of domestic violence, and it does coalesce, join with different issues in different groups. I remember a client of mine who said, I want to serve the order of protection, I want him to stop, but if he comes over, I don't want the cops to kill him like Amadou. I remember a woman who said to me, if a rich white man is after you and your children, there is no justice. And there is a harsh, hard cultural mix with every culture where violence against women is the issue.
I mean, I would just add to that, because I think everybody said it so well, that I think that, culture matters, and culture definitely matters when you're working with a survivor, because it's really important. I mean, we're not going to be an expert of the person's culture, but it's really important to really listen to what that person is saying. I'll always remember, I worked in a program that partners with the NYPD, and I remember this one police officer who I really thought was a great officer. He was one of the domestic violence police officers, and a woman who was from Ghana, her husband had been arrested, and she was telling us that she couldn't go back home because his family would be really upset that he was arrested and would blame her. And the officer, in his wanting to provide support to her, basically said, don't worry, it'll be okay. They'll understand. And he totally missed that in her culture, and he was trying to do the right thing. He was trying to be compassionate and empathetic, but he
didn't hear what she was saying. So I think it's, it's really important that we listen. And I think, one of the things I would also point out is, what is happening in our country in terms of immigrants. We are seeing, immigrants that are afraid to come forward, who are victims of violence, whether it be violence in the home or violence in the community, because ICE is showing up in courthouses, or ICE is showing up. They were out in Queens, out in front of the Family Justice Center. So, what does that mean, and how are we, addressing that so that people can feel comfortable to access services, here in New York City. We're a sanctuary city, but yet, we still need to make sure that that immigrant can be as safe as they can be. And not just them, but the person who's causing harm, because they may want the violence to stop, but they don't necessarily want that person to be picked up by ICE and to be deported.
And because culture is so important, and say for us, when we practice the model client-centered practice, where we don't tell clients what to do, we don't advise clients. We do an assessment and assess with client what their needs are, and help the client to prioritize their needs. I think it's important to understand where they come from. Every culture and every people is different, so not every service is applied to every single person.
More recently, I think there's been increased awareness with respect to financial abuse. Serena Williams is the spokesperson for the Purple Purse program. Essentially, that could mean that a partner in a relationship could be making a lot of money, but because of the addictive nature of the violence of the relationship, that person may have to turn over their paycheck or have their spending limited. So I would like your perspective on why financial abuse is so incredibly significant when we talk about domestic violence.
Well, I mean, I think if you consider the premise of DV at its core, it's power and control, right? It's not really even about physical abuse. The physical abuse is usually a manifestation that comes after many years of that vicious cycle of conflict and abuse, then the honeymoon phase when they make up, and then they go back to the conflict. And that's the addictive nature of the domestic violence cycle. So cutting someone off from their social circle, from their financial well-being, from their network is the real crime. And obviously, anyone who does not have access to their resources is going to be even more isolated and even more disenfranchised from any network that can potentially get them out of their situation.
I just remember when I started my career as an advocate, I just remember one of my first clients, I spent like the whole day trying to get the shelters or services for the client. And I remember the client coming back and saying, I'm coming back home. I was questioning myself as to what I did wrong. And I remember going back to my supervisor and say, I think I'm doing a horrible job. I don't understand what happened to this client. I spent almost the whole day helping the client. But guess what? That client thought about it herself and the children. Before, it used to be, I think, shelter 3 months. So the client thought about it, what am I going to do with my children after 3 months? So she decided to come back to her abuser. So sometimes we blame the victims and say, well, you go back. But that victim probably is facing economic situation, and they afford the return to the abuser.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I mean, I think that the number one need, I mean, I think this is probably since the beginning of the movement, that survivors identify that if they could, leave a relationship and be safe, it's housing and it's financial. and you can't find housing if you don't have the finances. So I think that that is something that is real. There was recent research that an academic did looking at or interviewing survivors who had left their home and gone into shelter. And a very high majority of them had said that if they knew what they had to give up, including their housing, they never would have went into shelter. So I think this is something that, and this is, you know, in addition to a person's being financially abused, you know, as a tactic when they're still in the relationship, there's the financial abuse or the inability to support oneself that just exacerbates the, either exacerbates the violence or really prevents that person from, you know, leaving and staying away. You know, we run probably about 50% of the domestic violence shelters here in New York City. And a startling fact, I remember when I first heard it a couple of years ago, 30% of victims of domestic violence who go into shelter leave within the first 4 weeks of going in. And I think that speaks to what Josefa was talking about. You know, they leave for a variety of reasons, and one of the reasons they leave is they go in when they really need that immediacy, that shelter, but then they realize, well, what am I going to do for housing? You know, and maybe they've given up an affordable apartment, or they know they can't live on their own, so they can manage their risk by staying with this person who's causing harm.
The Purple Purse initiative is very remarkable. It's got many aspects to it. Some are really helping people lean in to getting work, lean into career development. Maureen spoke about the trauma-based approach, really understanding what it means in people's hearts and minds to be overwhelmed. Trauma is being overwhelmed. It makes problem solving no easier and often far more difficult to have survived trauma. I say to my students, if I reach in my handbag, take out a gun and hold it on you, would your world change? Would your ability to do things change? When you get home that night, would you be different? And just the accumulation of traumas make it hard to attack problems, to develop solutions. So a big piece of our work is something we're going to talk about, the necessary nature of us all working together in a variety of helping professions and really understanding how trauma has affected minds and the help and support people need to restructure, sensitive, comprehensive help to restructure as an alternative and an improvement on victim blaming. Why does she stay? Why doesn't she go back? If I was one of these battered women, I'd never stay. There's an awful lot of that. And a lot of feelings traditionally of helplessness. The extended family, the police officers, the emergency room doctors traditionally feel very helpless and overwhelmed. And we'll be getting into how important it is that the helpers work together.
All right, so I want to just touch base on an idea that Dr. Ippolito began discussing earlier. Anecdotally, we are seeing connections between certain forms of expanded violence and domestic violence. So I'll start with Dr. Ippolito. What have you found, or is there a nexus between domestic violence abusers and some of the mass killings that we've seen recently?
Oh, fabulous question. My students at Monroe have heard me discuss the case of someone that's not topical now, Charles Whitman. Charles Whitman he's probably the first of the very publicized mass murderers in American history, going back to 1966, I believe it was, when this happened. Now, who was Charles Whitman? Charles Whitman was born into a successful family. His father was a successful businessman. But this was a man, the father, who routinely beat his wife, probably came close to killing Charles Whitman several times. Charles Whitman was out when he was about 15, got drunk and, got a little sloppy, I guess, and Pop threw him in a swimming pool and held his head under the water and very nearly killed him. And this was routine behavior. To get away from his father, Charles Whitman joined the Marine Corps, where he excelled. Now, this was someone who had an IQ probably around 160. He was very smart. And by the way, this is another thing. The violence in the home will sometimes stifle someone's ability academically in other ways. So they may seem to be much less intelligent than what they are, when in point of fact, they're just in a state of continuous anxiety and they can't perform. Whitman, when he went to the service, initially he did very well, but this is someone who probably was suffering initially from repeated post-traumatic stress that now became chronic. And if you read a book that Ann Pauley was gracious enough to give me some years ago, Judith Herman's work on trauma, you'll notice this was very complex PTSD as opposed to a one-time event. This was repetitive. And with that, his performance in the Marine Corps began to slide. But before that happened, the Marines gave him a scholarship to the University of Texas, where he studied engineering. Once he was away from all that discipline, he began to drink, he began to experiment with drugs. He even got into organized crime. He was a loan shark, and it's very strange behavior for a kid from Texas. The Marines eventually withdrew his scholarship, and he got a less than honorable discharge. Now, at this point, Whitman, he felt that his pride was wounded, and yet he goes back to the person that he had the most trouble with in life, who was his father, and asked him for help. And the father said, "I'll help you," but he took that occasion to abuse him a little bit more, saying, "You're a failure," and all this kind of stuff. Whitman went back to the University of Texas. He became a student. He met a young woman. He got married, and everything was fine. At some point, he began to assault his wife. He began to drink. His studies lapsed, and the wife said, "I can't take this too much anymore," and so the marriage began to fall apart. Whitman's response to this was to go to his mother's house and murder his mother. Then he killed his wife while she was sleeping, and then he got all his firearms, and he had quite a collection of firearms, and he put them in a footlocker, put on a workman's uniform, went to the University of Texas, climbed up to the top, and he began shooting. And for about an hour, the police weren't sure what was happening. They thought it was several snipers up on the roof, but he had positioned weapons all around the clock tower, and he was shooting from different positions, running from one to the other. He shot about 40 people, killed about 17, including the first victim was a pregnant woman, and he intentionally, with a high-powered rifle, focused on the unborn child. This we know. Eventually, now this is before there were SWAT teams or any of that. There was no such concept at the time. Eventually, 3 very brave police officers got to the top of the tower, and with some civilians, and Whitman was killed at the top of the tower. Now, the thing to consider here is the nexus, as you point out, between the abuse at home, the domestic violence, the murders, and everything else that happened in Charles Whitman's life. Clearly, if we teach somebody violence by practicing violence on them, we should not be surprised if they then later decide they're going to practice some of it themselves. Most domestic violence, in my experience, is learned. It's passed and may even be multi-generational. So I think there is a very clear convergence or interactivity between what people experience in their lives and what happens later. Another example of this would be Saddam Hussein, who was absolutely brutalized when he was young. And he was later raised by an uncle, essentially to be a hired assassin. So there, I mean, we can see any number of examples in these very extreme cases, but there's a lot more that go on just locally. maybe not quite as dramatic or quite as impactful, but things that we must take this behavior seriously. So, yes, you're quite right. It goes on.
Would anyone else like to comment on that?
How's everyone doing out there? I see fidgeting. Are we still with us? Still with us? Clap if you hear me. Okay. We're almost done, almost getting to Q&A. I have nothing to add to that other than the most recent police shooting was in response to a domestic violence incident, which is pretty sad.
Just some related statistics, and our panel may want to punctuate this with more information. We are looking at the correlation between mass shooting and hating women and perpetrating domestic violence, like Whitman, the first, many people consider the case Professor Polito just described, the first American mass shooting from a perpetrator of domestic violence. Also, significant data, domestic dispute calls are the calls where police officers are most likely to be injured or killed. We see grouping of white supremacists, but who are America's largest source of terror right now, people who avow themselves as white supremacists, but a real culture of women hating and women resentment and a history of battering is also very typical of that group.
So there's no doubt that there's a high correlation between mass shootings and domestic violence. I think one of the stats I read that 57% of the mass shootings, there was an intimate partner or a family member that was killed along with other people. So I think that that's real. And I think it's something that, we really need to look at. I think probably more importantly, we need to look at guns, because I think that guns are what are increasing the likelihood that a homicide will occur. High percentage, I think it's 50-something% of women that are killed by an intimate partner are killed by a gun. And when there's a gun in the home, it also, I think it's 500 more times that a woman will be killed. So I think that this is something that is really important that we look at. And not to be cynical, but I am going to be a little cynical here. I think that it's good that we're starting to see research about the connection between mass shooting and domestic violence, because if we're going to look at mass shootings and we make that connection to domestic violence, then maybe we'll start looking at domestic violence in a way differently. It's like what happened years ago with the connection between the criminal justice system and how they responded to victims of domestic violence. Before there was any mandatory arrest, there were women that were severely assaulted, that were killed, and the police were not responding appropriately. And then what happened? They were getting, counties and police departments were getting sued across the country, and millions of dollars was being paid out. And that led to significant changes in how the criminal justice system responds to domestic violence. So sometimes it takes something else for the response to change, and if that something else is to look at mass shootings and that will have an impact on domestic violence, then I think that hopefully will be something positive that will come out of it.
So I have one final question before we open it up to the audience for questions. One final question. Can you elaborate a little bit further on the interdisciplinary approach to assisting victims of domestic violence? So the interdisciplinary approach.
Well, this is the key intervention in domestic violence is when we all work together. We often, helpers often feel powerless. Family members feel powerless, extended family. All of us figure, the first time your relative knocks on your door and says, "Can the kids and I stay with you tonight?" You say, "Yeah." But if it's the 17th time, it's the 25th time, family feels helpless. Police officers often feel helpless. Maybe it's the second, the third, the fourth time there's been a dispute in that residence, and on one of the calls, a victim protects the abuser, jumps on the police officer. Healthcare advocates and medical personnel don't know what to say, are in fear of saying the wrong thing, may see the same people over and over, and become very frustrated. If we all work together, Liz mentioned how important that is, that healthcare professionals know whom to go to at the hospital, that there's a DV coordinator. Maureen here really made a difference in this country about bringing domestic violence human service workers into the police precinct, so police have partners. And I want everybody's thoughts on that, and I'm sorry if I don't want to hog this mic, but honestly, to you beginning your careers, if you care, study. If you're a CJ major, take our geriatrics course. If you're a nursing major, take our criminal justice domestic violence course. Become well aware in planning your career of these connections so you can discuss them in your job interviews and join our team.
Thank you for that. I'm glad to say that at Montefiore, and I know a lot of health systems are looking to do this coordination of helping survivors access services and support better. I think for us, what we've been doing to do this a little bit more intentionally in recent years is training up all staff on what a trauma-informed response means. So that's not just for survivors, but that's for anybody that walks through the door. How do we approach those people in a way that is respectful of whatever their past experiences or even that experience that day could have been? And so that sort of forms the basis for us at Montefiore for how we approach our patients. Layered on top of that is specific interdisciplinary training, outlining very specific roles for everybody in the care team about how they can support survivors and families who are experiencing domestic violence. And then, as Professor Pauly mentioned, then we know that it can't stop with us, that we need to extend our support into the community. So forming those partnerships with organizations like Safe Horizon and the Family Justice Center is integral for the work that we do. But having that coordinated response so that, again, everybody knows if this is something that somebody's struggling with, if this is an issue, this is what you need to do, because the survivor needs to know that A, this is a healthcare issue, B, that healthcare cares about this issue, and that C, we can help do something about it. I just want to share a really brief story that will always, I think, be with me for the rest of my life and kind of highlights this. When I was a DV advocate at Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston, this is 10 years ago now, I had a woman come into the ED who was asking for support for a domestic violence situation. She had been in a barber shop with her 3-year-old and her abuser, and saw the bus drive by while she was in the barber shop, and said while her abuser was in the chair, "Oh, I'm going to take the baby outside to get a drink." Ran to the bus, begged the driver to let her on without bus fare, came to the hospital, to the emergency room, had a purple card that we had at that time for that program, a purple card that she said she'd had in her possession for 6 years. From when she had been hospitalized 6 years prior, she kept that with her for the opportune moment that she could get away from that abuser, and she seized that moment that day and came and got support. If that doesn't give you chills, I don't know what will. But, and it's the type of thing in this work that we helped connect her to resources, we helped her get shelter. I don't know what happened to her. Sometimes you do find out, but most of the time you don't know. But I think being prepared to sit there and be a witness, a supportive, compassionate witness to that person's story, and then helping them with whatever it is that they're wanting to do in that moment, that's the key.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that if we're operating on the idea that domestic violence is a complex system of many variables, well, then we need all the various disciplines to participate in trying to ameliorate this problem. That means the medical doctors, the psychiatrists, the crisis intervention counselors, the clergy, teachers, everybody has to be involved. And to show you how that works in practice, Some years ago, Aunt Paulie helped me out a whole lot. We had a student here at Monroe, young lady, very intelligent, obviously was going to go very far. And it turned out that there were some problems in the background that we needed a few different people to help address this. Now, this young woman had been married but separated. There had been some problems. Well, it turned out that the husband was extremely abusive. And then other things had come out. Part of the problem, I think, was that this young girl was an incest victim from the age of 6 till 16. And the assailant was her biological father, who used to tell her, this is our special relationship, you have to keep it secret, the usual things that go on with pedophilia. She thought this was sort of normal until he told her when she was 16, and she had gotten very tall, well, you look too much like your mother now, so I'm not interested in you. And she went into a little bit of a tailspin from that. Well, she kind of came back from it, but no one knew no one ever knew about this until many years later. Well, the man she married was, I don't know, didn't know him very well, but both of them had taken the test for a police department. And she got a very high score, higher than his. Now, they were separated at the time, and his response to this was to call up her mother, who he didn't get along with, and say, how dare your daughter get a higher grade than me? I'm going to come to your house and blow it up. Which she went over to the house, and now a lot of phone calls are going back because he said he was coming to Monroe College. He was going to do some violence here. So we, thanks to Professor Paulie, we were able to get her to a shelter, and she eventually could not accept this appointment to the police department because this man was actively threatening her life all the time. And by the way, this was a man who wants to be a cop. Okay, I've often wondered what type of policeman he would have made. Anyway, she no longer lives in New York State. She had to go far away, essentially to her own version of the witness protection program, just to get away from this individual. So, what's the moral of the story? There's a lot of problems that contribute to other problems, and there's only one way to deal with it. We have to get a lot of specialists and people to help out, which we were able to do something that night. But how about all the folks that don't have that, don't have an Aunt Paulie, available? It becomes very difficult.
I'll just add that the DiVA campaign, because we understood that domestic violence had so many impacts, we tried our best to message that everyone was part of the solution. So whether you were a bank teller at a local branch, or you were a child's teacher that was engaging with a parent, or you were that police officer, you were essentially an ambassador of help for that individual. I hope that message continues.
Thank you so much. We're going to actually open it up to questions. So I will bring the mic. If you have a question, please raise your hand. The event is still ongoing. This is the question and answer portion. The event is still ongoing.
Good evening, everyone. My question revolves around, we discussed a lot in regards to...
Let's be respectful to the question and answer. If you have to exit the room, can you do so quietly? Thank you for coming. I hope you learned something that saves a life.
So we spoke a lot in regards to uniformed personnel responding to the aid of individuals in distress from domestic violence. But I was curious to know, myself being a law enforcement officer and being a union representative, where does the outreach come into the uniformed personnel that are suffering from domestic violence? where does this personnel go when they are in need of help, or they are, because, you know, we spoke about it's a power struggle. Of domestic violence has to do with power, authority, which many of these professions, that's what they do all day, or that's what they're that's something that's their mantle, that's something they wear. Many of them, the agencies frown upon seeking help, so they find themselves in many situations where where's their outlet, or how do they address that or seek that help?
So I have worked for practically my whole career working with the NYPD, and I think your question is a great question, and I think that the police department does provide services. I can speak for the NYPD. They provide services for members of the service, whether they're members of service and civilian members who are victims of domestic violence. I think the problem, we see this with mental health. I mean, we had, I believe, 9 or 10 suicides this year so far of police officers killing themselves. And, you know, who knows if there was violence in the home that led to the trauma that led to that suicide. I mean, I don't know. I think that more needs to be done so that it's safer for that person who needs help to come forward. You know, there are organizations like PAPA and other outside organizations where a person can come. They can come to Safe Horizon. You know, we're a totally confidential organization that they can come to, and we would not, even though we partner with the NYPD and have advocates working in police precincts, we would not share information with the police department. I think the other thing that, you know, that needs to happen is, I mean, the police department also, if that person is causing harm, that police officer is causing harm, they have a protocol in how an officer needs to respond if they're called to the scene, and you know, who has to respond to that scene up the chain of command. So all of that, I think, is something that, you know, is happening. I recently had a conversation with, I meet regularly with senior level staff in the NYPD, where they wanted to talk with us about what more could be done for members of the service so that they do feel safer in coming forward, whether it's partnering more with advocates in the community so they could feel, you know, that there is more, you know, confidentiality around coming forward. And I'm going to be honest with you, even if there is, you know, more confidentiality, I think the reality is that we live in a society where if that police officer is a man, men don't often seek services, you know, when they're experiencing trauma. You know, we are an agency that sees almost 300,000 clients every year, and the majority of them are women. And this is for all, we see all victims of crime. The majority of them are women. Since we rolled out a program where we have advocates in precincts, we've seen an increase in the number of men. I mean, a significant increase in the number of men that we see in our agency. And in 1 year, just in this police program, we saw almost 60,000 clients. You know, about 50% of them were victims of all crimes, and the other 50% were victims of domestic violence. And the reason we believe we're seeing a lot more men is because the men are coming to us for services. In this program, we look at all the police reports and we follow up. So we'll pick up the phone and we'll call you and say, I know you filed a police report for an incident that occurred in your home or for an assault. I'd like to talk with you about that. I'm an advocate working in the precinct, and we'll engage with you. So now you can come to us. And that, I think, has led to, and you know, and not to say that we're able to engage with everybody, but we're seeing that we're able to engage a lot more. And I think so it's, you know, it's connected to the police department, but I think it's also connected to way, you know, how men are socialized in our society. And the police department, while it's more diverse in terms of gender, it's still a predominantly, you know, male-dominated system.
Willie, that question is excellent, but I don't think you realize how frightening that question is to a bureaucracy like the police department. First of all, as you know from your own experience, most police are hesitant to come forward with any type of complaint or problem about anything. A close friend of mine, a very successful detective, was diagnosed with stomach cancer and went through chemotherapy and surgery and the job never knew it. All they said, gee, are you losing weight? And he said, oh yeah, I'm running a little bit more. And I think he only told a few of us. He said, look, I'm going in for surgery, so just so you know, but I'm afraid to tell the job because they might sideline me and take my gun away or put me on a desk duty, and he'd rather suffer through this than let anyone know. Now, in the area of domestic violence, it gets even stickier, because now if you have criminal behavior occurring within, let's say, a police family, that raises a whole nother level of concerns bureaucratically. And even there, well, I'll give you an example. Two close friends of mine, husband and wife, both very seasoned detectives. Been married for some years. The wife was a good woman, very tough. She had a good record, a lot of awards, the whole thing. Came to me one day and started to ask some peculiar questions. How do you and your wife get along? And how's everything with your son? And which I thought was a little strange. So I said, well, we're doing pretty well, we have whatever the usual things go on in marriage, but we're doing pretty good. She said, has there ever been any violence? I said, no. And she started crying. And this is very strange behavior. Well, it turned out that she had been a victim of domestic violence of her husband for some time. Now, here's a woman who's a very successful law enforcement person. And it was very clear that this man, who I knew very well, and he was a friend, but he was starting to go sideways. He just wasn't acting himself anymore. And she never informed the job, never said anything. What she did, she took an early retirement and went to another state and got a divorce, and that was the answer to the problem. The answer was no answer because no one ever did anything. This man, by the way, I could mention his name, but I won't because, well, he should be out now, but he was incarcerated because after the divorce, he was out one night and met a woman and gave her a date rape drug and wound up getting, I don't know how many years in prison for kidnapping and rape. So here's a hero. This was a hero detective. This was a great guy. And I just don't know what happened, but it turns out that for many years, he had been beating his wife. She's got a gun, and she just took it. So why does this happen? Because she didn't want, probably because she didn't want the job to know that this was going on, for whatever was going to take place after that. Right? So sometimes the bureaucratic strictures work against us, but that's a good question.
Hi. So this is a particular case where a friend of mine, he used to always report this case that his sister's husband was abusing her. Because she didn't want to admit it and report it, they couldn't do anything. It turned out that one day he sent the kids to the water park away with his aunt. And when they got back, his wife was killed, and he made it seem like he staged the whole scene. Like he killed her in the kitchen, he brought her to the bed and made it seem like someone broke in and killed her. His family knew everything, so they reported, so the police investigated, and it turned out that he killed her. The point that I'm trying to make and what I want to know is there any new ways? Is there anything new being implemented so that cases like this, so that we don't have to wait for someone to be murdered or, that was like 10 years ago. So from then to now, is there anything new being implemented to stop cases like this?
I mean, I'll say that, what, Josefa had mentioned earlier that, the work that we do at Safe Horizon is client-centered. And, that means that, we're going to listen to the client and they're going to tell us what's happening in their lives, what their situation, what is going on. And then we're going to talk with them about the options that work best for them in terms of safety planning. So I think that, even if somebody doesn't want to report to the police, because if the person doesn't want to report to the police, or if the person doesn't want to get involved in systems, they're an adult. We don't have mandated reporting for domestic violence, and I'm going to be honest, I don't think we ever should have mandated reporting, because I think that would take away the control from that individual, that survivor, as to what works best for them. Because calling the police could keep me safe, but calling the police may not keep you safe. And that's why, so I think that I always say, and I'm going to be honest with you, this is really hard to do. The best thing you can do as an individual for any survivor of domestic violence is to listen to them, believe them, and try not to judge them. And recognize that it's hard not to judge them. Because when that person is ready, they will come to you. And and there are some things, maybe you feel safe slipping them a number or the hotline number, or talking with them when the person who's causing harm is not around. Everybody is different, and you're gonna assess, but never underestimate the power of that. Because as Ann said, I'm sure that person, or Melissa said, that person that came here 6 years later with that card, that was because somebody probably listened to them and treated them in a way that they knew when they were ready that they could get the assistance that they needed. And that's really powerful, because I think that, to me, it's the little things that really matter, Ultimately, what is our goal? Of course, two things: stop domestic violence homicides and eradicate domestic violence. I don't want to be pessimistic, but we're a long way from there. But what we can do, and what we haven't done enough as a society, we've changed laws, we've changed practices, we've changed procedures. There's so many things that are different in the last 40 years that have a significant positive impact on victims, but what we don't have is we don't have public outrage. We do not have public, look at drunk driving. 25 years ago, if you got caught drinking and driving, what would happen to you? Maybe the cop would tell you to drive slowly, you probably weren't gonna get arrested, maybe they take your keys away. Now, fast forward 25 years now, what happens when you get caught drunk driving? You're probably going to get arrested. If there's a crash, you better get a good lawyer. If there's a fatality, you're going to be spending a lot of money. And what else has happened? So there's significant severe consequences, and the other thing is, what do we have? I grew up in a time, I'm dating myself, I used to bartend, and I'm going to be honest, I would think nothing of, serving people drinks, they get in their cars and they go driving away. I think nothing of getting into a car with somebody who was drunk and they would drive. My daughter, who's 31, grew up in an era where there was always DDs. She may go out and have a few drinks with her friends, but there was always a designated driver. Now, if you're out with friends, it's more likely that somebody's going to take your keys away from you and not let you drive. That's because of Mothers Against Drunk Driving, Students Against Drunk Driving. That's because of public outrage. We need the same thing with domestic violence. When we see somebody mistreating somebody before it even gets the physical assault, before it even gets the coercive control, if that person is demeaning or dismissing, stand up and say, you know what, that's not it. And not look at it if that's not my business, but really stand up. And of course, in a safe way, because, we want to do something that's safe for them, but also safe for ourselves.
I'm sorry but what I'm trying to say is, this person, she didn't say anything directly to the police, but her brother did. They reported it to the police, and that was 10 years ago. What I want to know is, is anything new being implemented so that when people report cases like this, if the victim doesn't want to testified or admit that they're being victimized, is there anything that is being implemented so that they can, so that the police can so that they can dig more to find out more and see if they can get these cases resolved?
Yeah, well, I think that, the police department in New York State, any police jurisdiction in New York State, it's a mandatory arrest. So that means that when police respond on the scene, when there's a domestic violence call, they have to determine what happened, was there a crime, and if there was a crime, they're mandated to make an arrest no matter what the survivor wants. Then there's, there's, in many cases, there's mandatory prosecution. And what the police officers, a police officer, when they're on the scene, should collect evidence so that the prosecutor can do what's called evidence-based prosecution. And what that means is, because the survivor may say, I don't want I call the police because I feel my life is in danger, but then I don't want to be involved in that prosecution. But if the police have gathered evidence, what's called excited utterances, or take pictures of the victim's injuries, take pictures of the crime scene, now the prosecutor could potentially move forward even if the victim doesn't want that to happen. So, and that's been happening easily for the last 10 years. Mandatory arrest has been around since 1996, and here in New York City, the New York City Police Department had mandatory arrest since the late 1980s, even before it became a state law.
If I may just respond to that. I'm a DV prosecutor in Westchester. There's no easy answer to your question, because in the criminal justice system, we still have to prove cases beyond a reasonable doubt. And the problem with domestic violence is it often takes place in the privacy of someone's home. So it is extremely difficult if the person to whom it is happening, the victim, is for a myriad of reasons, does not want to come forward on any particular incident. Sometimes it takes several incidences for the victim to be ready to go through the process. And it's a long process, and officers and sometimes even prosecutors are not always good to the people, to the victims, and as understanding as we need to be. But as she mentioned, we try in as many cases as we can to prosecute the cases without the complaining witness, the victim. And that's called the evidence-based prosecution, where we get the 911 recordings. We ask our officers that when they go out to, I always say this to the officer, imagine that the victim you see will not testify in court, and go through the investigation as if you were doing a homicide investigation where the dead person is never going to testify. We don't want our victims dead, but if the officers look at the case from that perspective, at the time the incident happens, they will knock on doors, and perhaps a neighbor will say something, will give a statement at that time. They will try and encourage the victim to allow them to take photographs to document the injury. They will try and help her to see that she should go to the hospital. And I say she because it's mostly women victims, that she should go to the hospital and get the injuries documented. And the laws have been changing, the case law has been changing, so that what she tells the medical personnel, we can use that, right? Because she has to tell the medical personnel how she got the injury. So they need that for treatment and diagnosis. We can sometimes use what's in the medical records without her having to come forward, right? So we can use that. We use the 911, we use the photographs. If the abuser is on scene, if they say anything to the officer, because the officer separates them and should tell me what happened, right? And they're just telling what happened. And sometimes they instinctively just say things. So we use all of that to try to prosecute the cases without the victim. And in the Bronx, I don't work in the Bronx, but in the Bronx, I know they do that because you have such a high incidence of homicides, right? So that's the answer.
we still have to meet our burden at trial, which is beyond a reasonable doubt. And as I said, for many of our victims, it's a myriad of reasons why at any given moment they don't want to go forward. But as a prosecutor, we always tell our victims, you might not be ready this time, but here's a number, please call the next time. And you always should call the police if you think you're in danger. As a family member, what you can do, most times, people don't commit crimes in your presence. Be supportive of her. Even her choice not to go forward, and it's hard, but be supportive of her so that when she's ready, she has a place to go. But there's no easy answer. And I've been doing domestic violence for like 18 years, and I'm telling you, I just say to myself, somebody's going to die. And in Westchester, most of our homicides, if they're not gun-related or drug-related, it's a DV victim. So when I get cases with just a slap, that's just a harassment. But that harassment could be my homicide next week. So we take all of them very seriously, right? So you just need to be supportive. And hopefully there are lots of services out there for the domestic violence victim. There's therapy for them to try and figure out what is it, because we also find that the domestic violence victim picks either the person picks them or they pick the same type of person. So we also encourage them to seek therapy. It's free, to try and get behind what is it? Why, what is it in your particular case that's making, when I look in my system, you've been here the 6th time and it's the same problem, right? But I'm sorry that happened to your friend, but we still have to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt.
Can I speak for Ms. Because I have somebody in this room who has been through this situation, and it wasn't by something called the police, it wasn't by something that I should do. And this person knows all the resources that are available to anybody in this situation. She did what I asked. That's all. As Marty mentioned, she just listened to me, she directed me as best as she could, she told me about the resources that were available to me, she told me about the programs that she knew about, and she let me make my own decisions. So I think ultimately, because what happened in your situation where another family member called the police, that escalates it for everybody. So if she had called the police in my situation, I probably would not be alive today. Because she could never have just angered me even more. Right? So as a family member, sometimes it's just doing, like Maureen said, what the person asks you, and if that fails, please believe me, do yoga. That's all I said. No, it's important, the clarity of mind and the inability to make decisions. So Melissa's my best friend, she can personally help me through it. But she had the clarity to say to me, you're not living clearly. Think about this, what about this, did you know about this? And then left me as a smart person to make the decisions on my own. And left the door open for me to ask questions. Left the door open for me to say, it's time for me, I'm ready, I'm moving. And she was there for me. As a family member, it's like one of the hardest positions to be in, especially someone with all the knowledge and resources that she has, but she could only do what I asked her to. And that was enough. Sometimes families get involved to a level where we as people being abused are not ready for that. It just escalates it and makes the situation even harder for us to figure out. So I think it's really important that Maureen says as a family member to listen and just offer the resources that you know are available. And when they're ready, they're ready. I've been 22 years later.
Hi, you said that there are programs for batterers. I just want to know how long does the accreditation process takes for a batterers intervention program, and does it work?
Yes, typical, some batterers intervention programs are 52 weeks, some of them, but most of them are 26 weeks. Honestly, the research has shown that they don't work. They don't change behavior. There's a lot of people that say, well, if they don't work, why do we keep on doing them? Why are we still creating batterers intervention program? That's why I think that, as I mentioned, the mayor's office is looking at it not just in terms of it not being court mandated, but also infusing trauma lens into that, because I think that I'm a big believer in accountability, but I also know that if we don't address the trauma that person has experienced, and it's finding that balance of addressing the trauma but holding them accountable at the same time.
And, I think what's really going to make a big difference, we have to start reaching our children, I mean, letting children know that violence is not the answer. And, before I retire, my dream come true, well, my first dream come true was the having advocates in every single police precinct. But my second dream come true would be having the Board of Ed here in New York City, and it's no longer called the Board of Ed, right? Department of Education here in New York City mandate in their classes teaching about healthy relationships and violence from pre-K all the way up, age appropriate. That would make a difference in terms of, children. So children who are living in homes where there's violence will be getting a different message, because think about how much time we spend in school and what a difference I believe that could make.
Thank you all so very much.
I'm sorry, we have one last question from a wonderful student who was class, but she wanted to stay to ask this question.
Thank you. Right now, I'm taking domestic violence in an online class. Kind of wish I was taking it in school, but because of my schedule, I can't. We were talking about, actually, our weekly discussion for this week was the pros and cons of having mandated reports. So I just wanted to know if you guys could answer that for me.
I mean, I'll give, quick answer. Mandated reporter for domestic violence? I'd say absolutely not. I don't even agree. There are some states that have mandated reporting for elder abuse, and I don't think that just because you turn 60 years old, all of a sudden you can't make your own decisions. And I think that we could place survivors in more danger if we say we have to start reporting to the authorities, and often the authorities are the police, because the police can be a helping and a protective factor for many survivors, but they're not, a protective factor for all survivors, and it could place some survivors in more danger, and survivors are the experts in their own lives.
As my friend shared, had I intervened and gone against her wishes, she may not be sitting here, and that's really powerful, so.
So I would like to thank our panelists. This was an exceptional event, the first time at Monroe College, DiVA 2019. We were so proud and so honored to be able to spread more information and resources, research on domestic violence. Some of our students did have to leave for their classes. They stayed as long as they could, so that means it was a robust and interesting discussion. But I really thank our panelists for everything that you've done, and we hope to continue to partner with you in the future. So thank you so much.